Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today's episode title is Heard on the Street, a concept that we developed with today's very special guest, Phil Venables. Can you tell our boardroom listeners a little bit about this concept?
Yeah, sure. When we developed Heard on the Street, we wanted to reflect the real talk that happens behind the closed doors in the boardrooms. So think of it as connecting the dots between the cybersecurity, risk, and business in the boardroom. It's all that shared experience, the smart insights about how cyber and digital transformations can impact the business.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating discussion. So let's get right to the episode.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to have a special guest joining us, someone whose experience and strategic vision have helped shape the industry that we work in. Phil Venables, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Great to be here.
Okay, Phil, so obviously you're the former CISO of Google Cloud, and it's incredibly fitting, I think, that you're joining us today. Much of the groundwork that, as part of our board of directors initiative, has come about under your leadership as CISO, including this actual podcast. So it's great to have you here.
Yes, and today you are a strategic security advisor at Google. But looking back at your career, you are a 4-time CISO, 5-time board director, chief risk officer, and you've also been involved in several public sector initiatives. And actually, we have known you ever since we started our careers in a financial services cyber realm, because you have always been known to everyone in the sector as an expert. And you certainly remain that.
That's always good to know. That's another way of saying, I've been around for decades. It's the synonym for, experience equals old, but I'll take it.
Now, I must say, when I said from the beginnings of our career, we've been going on for ages too. Well, some of us longer than others, but...
So let's dive into the various C-suite perspectives on cybersecurity and digital transformation, including those from the board, CISOs, CROs, CIOs, and CTOs, as well as some insights from leading industry organizations. And so, Phil, of course, I'm going to ask specifically about board members, but maybe just to start us off, as one of the architects, really, of the Heard on the Street concept, can you talk a little bit about the driving kind of ideas behind capturing these different viewpoints and why it's crucial to have the full picture when you're considering cyber risk?
Yeah, one of the interesting things that we did, to your point, is as Google and Google Cloud specifically with our relationships, is it's not just with CISOs, it's with CIOs, CTOs, board members, CEOs, so we regularly present to boards of customers. We have our own CISO customer advisory board, but we probably spend just as much time in the advisory board for our CIOs and CTOs. And what's always been fascinating is just all of the different perspectives on security and compliance and privacy and risk that come through those. And what's kind of fascinating is just that everybody treats security as a number 1 priority or number 2 priority, but it's certainly up there always as a top priority. But everybody expresses it in different ways. Like the CISOs will take a more operational view of things. The CIOs will be all about how can they do security through the lens of also making sure that they have productivity and agility. And then the boards have almost like a kind of a split view of this one, which is how to make sure security doesn't get in the way of their business strategy and what they need to get done, but also looking at it through a safety and compliance and making sure the organization is protected lens. So one of the things that's always been good is how we bring that kind of different perspectives to each of those different groups. They learn a lot from how we see the world through how other people see the world.
Yeah, that's great. And so kind of drilling in then on the perspective from boards specifically, how do you think that the approach that boards take to cyber risk oversight has evolved in recent years? And what do you think are some of the key factors that are driving that?
Yeah, I think when you go back, certainly a couple of decades, most of the board engagement on information security, cybersecurity, technology risk in general was really kind of through them just being educated as to the threat. Again, if you go back a couple of decades, there were bad things happening. There was, various waves of internet worms, malware-driven outages, data breaches. There was certainly enough incidents, but not what you've seen over the past recent 10 years. So there was still a lot of basic education that boards needed. And certainly the first few boards I did 20 odd years ago, most of it was about taking them through threat briefings, helping them understand technology, helping them understand the threat actors, what could go wrong, how we were mitigating it. And fast forward to today, it's a much more strategic conversation with boards about, are we investing enough? Are we configuring the entire enterprise and its supply chain in the right way to marry up security with resilience, with business agility, productivity? And it's a much different level of engagement. It's moved from the kind of dealing with the fear and uncertainty to actually dealing with this as a strategic imperative and what's the best way to go about driving that. And that's been a big change. And I think also overlaid throughout that whole process has been the compliance obligations, because clearly at the very, very beginning of cyber, apart from a few specific industries, there was not a lot of rules and regulation and compliance expectations around this stuff. Now there is, and that's evolved over many years. So I think most boards now, or at least the Fortune 500 boards, are very clear that you don't get security by only doing compliance. They're very clear that security needs to be a broader thing, but they're also very, very clear that operating in certain markets and certain businesses, you have to have a minimum set of compliance. And if you get the compliance wrong, sometimes it might not matter if you get the security wrong because you've lost your business license or your ability to operate. And so they're also, boards in most industries are also very, very focused on compliance. And I think on the CISOs, as we all know, it's important to keep educating the board that compliance is necessary but not sufficient. You still have to do other things beyond compliance to manage security.
You touched a bit on CISOs, and I know you've just moved from the CISO role, and I know that some of us who have done that call ourselves recovering CISOs or recovered CISOs. So I hope that recovery journey isn't too hard for you. But moving from that operational intensity of a CISO role to the oversight perspective of a board director is quite a shift, right? And so what advice would you give the current CISOs with ambitions to become effective board members?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and this is useful to think about in two ways, is a successful CISO in engaging with your own board is all about how you put some technical risks into a business context. As we all know, boards want to engage on what's the impact of their business, not just what's a particular technical vulnerability. And so the most successful CISOs in how they interact with the board are very commercial and very business-centric and talk in the language of how the risks that they care about impact the business mission and business strategy, and can articulate and talk to board members and peer and other executives around what that potential business impact is. Now, the reason I kind of stress that is, when boards, you become a board member either through some kind of recruiting process, but more often than not, you become a board member because another board member has recommended you for a board. And so I know a lot of CISOs out there that are all chief risk officers or others that have become board members because one of their own board members that they presented to was on the board of another company that needed an additional board member that could cover technology, security, risk, other things. And so your ability to portray yourself as a commercial, business-focused leader that just happens to be specializing in security, risk, compliance, all these other topics is the most important thing for your day job as a CISO, but that's also the thing that will help you get noticed in the board community and recommended for a board position. And I think once you've got that first board position, sometimes it's quite easy to get the second and third, depending if that's what you want to do. But certainly always thinking about how you portray these technical and security risks in a business context is good for your job and good for your prospects as a board member.
And turning the perspective slightly, what advice would you give to current CISOs on building strong and productive relationships with the board on cyber matters?
I think the main thing to do, and it's just like a kind of any other thing, which is to build relationships with the board members that are outside the formality of the board meeting. One of the things I've learned over many years, both as a person presenting to boards and engaging with boards on risk management and security, as well as being a board member, is The board meeting itself, it could be 2 or 3 hours, and there's various kind of hours of different committees like the audit committee, the risk committee, governance committee, various other things. But surrounding the board meeting, there are dinners, meetings, other events. And one of the most useful things to do is have those meetings, have those education sessions, build dialogue and relationships with the board members around the board meeting itself, so that once you're actually in the board meeting, the actual board meeting, that's mainly just a bit of a formality. The actual work has been done on talking to the board members on a regular basis, especially around the board meeting, to build those relationships, to educate them, and also to get them in an environment where they feel comfortable asking more in-depth questions that they may not either want to potentially show up their lack of knowledge inside a board meeting, which is unusual these days, but is certainly a consideration. But most likely they don't want to take up a larger amount of time in the board meeting. The board meetings themselves tend to be quite time compressed, and sometimes a board member that has got particular interest or desire to oversee the cyber elements more deeply may want to spend hours with you, the CISO, that they don't get to spend inside the formality of the board meeting. And I think having that relationship and having that construct is very useful in both directions. And again, as in the moments when I've been a board director looking at these types of topics, I think I've gained more insight, and I think I've been able to be more helpful outside of the board meetings than in the board meetings themselves, and that's a big factor. So if you find yourself only being in the literal board meeting for your 20, 30 minute, 1 hour element of the meeting, then you're probably not doing enough. You need to think broadly about relationships outside the boardroom.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to pivot a little bit into risk. So I came from financial services, working in second line of defense and risk and compliance. I know that you also were a chief risk officer. So how did you work to quantify and to qualify cybersecurity risks in a way that allowed the board to understand their potential business impact?
So as you shift gears, as you said, into thinking about what a risk function does as opposed to, say, an operational security function, a risk function, especially as it typically, at least in many organizations, will either report up to the CFO, CEO, or in some regulated industries will actually report directly to the board, particularly the board risk committee or audit committees. And the interesting thing about many risk functions is they really have kind of two parallel tracks in what they do. The basic kind of table stakes for a risk function is acting on behalf of the board to independently oversee whether management and the organization in general is identifying all the appropriate risks, managing those risks within some set of defined limits, and then being able to determine if the organization is really kind of focused on mitigating and positioning itself well against all the risks that it really should care about. The second track, though, is what really differentiates many risk functions, and in fact many CISO functions as well, is looking across the organization and spotting innovations or techniques in one business unit that should be usefully applied to other business units. And it's generally kind of acting like an organizational intelligence function that is sucking data out of the entire organization and replaying it back to everybody to keep improving everybody's best practices. So it's almost like, how do they provide that conduit for improvements from one area for that to be effective across the rest of the organization? So again, table stakes is independent oversight and acting on behalf of the board. Really, really good risk functions actually add a lot of value to their businesses by being that conduit for best practices. And then in the context of how you then specify and provide that oversight, I think a lot of defining more quantitative-based approaches rather than just qualitative assessments is important, and defining the right risk metrics and putting limits and thresholds around that so the board has some degree of control or lever about where they want to set the risk limits for certain types of risks. The risk function can facilitate that process. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're in a regulated industry or not, whether you're an enterprise risk function or an independent risk management function, can provide a lot of value to help management and the board interact in much more specific and quantitative ways as opposed to just kind of vague statements of kind of what they want to achieve.
So you mentioned kind of the quantitative approach to it, and I still have a lot of discussions both with board members, but also from CISOs and CROs around board reporting, and what are the best KRIs or metrics out there that should go into board reporting? Any thoughts on that?
There's a maturity curve that most organizations have to go through. I think when organizations are at their early stage of trying to quantify and involve the board in the management of cybersecurity risk, I think it's right to focus on some real basic stuff. And these could be like enterprise conformance to vulnerability management, to configurations, to looking at what you might call the lagging indicators of performance like data leaks, breaches, vulnerabilities, various other things. I think you have to go through that, but ultimately you have to surpass that and go to the next level and start moving the board and executive leadership to think about more leading indicators of success. And these leading indicators are more kind of meta level things like what percentage of software do you have in an environment where you can reproducibly build it and securely manage your software base? What percentage of your environment's configuration can you reliably rebuild in the event of a disaster? And so there's a whole array of these things that if you get them right, you almost can't help but get security right. But the reason kind of the boards find these more engaging, in my experience, is that these are the things also that drive other things that the boards are interested in, such as the ability of the business to configure itself to be more agile and productive, to be more competitive, to get products to market quicker. And so I think once you go through that maturity level of the basic security metrics, then getting onto more leading indicator metrics that help the board understand how is my organization configured to not just respond to security goals, but to do those in a way that still advance our competitive position and our business strategy. Those are the real metrics that you want to get at. And one of the things I'm sure you'll put in the show notes, there's links to plenty of blog posts we've done that describe some of these things based on our own internal experience at Google as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely include those resources in the post.
Putting ourselves in the board members' shoes again, cyber sometimes, and I remember at the beginning of my career as a CISO and before then as a consultant, was considered to be a black box. And the boards were saying, can you demystify the black box for us? And the same goes for the business folks, right? They consider the word cyber straight away belongs to CISO rather than anything to do with the business. But what are some of the key technical aspects of cybersecurity and technology that you believe are crucial for the board members, business leaders to understand even at high level? And there's been a lot of talk about cybersecurity expertise on boards. How can we balance this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not always a big fan of the notion that boards should have like a designated cybersecurity expert on the board that doesn't also have a lot of expertise in other things. As we all know, board slots are quite limited in terms of how organizations want to staff their boards. And there's only so many like experts you can put on there that aren't also experts at many other things. And so I think when you look at board membership and board makeup, you absolutely need a higher percentage of the board that has a deeper understanding of technology and how implementing digitization of their business can actually advance their business strategy. And so having more people that understand technology, not necessarily technologists, but people that have been in line executive roles, in business transformation roles that have used technology to deliver advantage for their company. And then at the same time, all of those people should have some experience of thinking about how does technology risk in general, not just security, but things like resilience and reliability and privacy, all of those contribute to that. Now, it could be that you do have a CISO or former CISO on the board, but it's important for them to also to be able to exhibit a broader understanding of business strategy, to contribute to other board discussions and not just be the cybersecurity person. This is also important because, like on many topics that the boards oversee, you want the whole of board to be thinking about and contributing to this, as opposed to just 9 out of 10 of them just kind of switch off while it's the cyber presentation and the one designated cybersecurity board member focus on. That's not a useful or productive way of managing oversight and managing risk. So I think ultimately boards should be more technology aware, and in the context of that, understanding cybersecurity risks in the context of their business. And that's something that they can get through education. That's something they've probably got through experience of their other boards or running the businesses that they still do run or did run in the past in their operating roles. And I think just making sure that they keep focused on that and keep getting educated and up to date. And there's many opportunities as well for boards, even if they don't have specific designated expertise on the board, to have board advisors rather than board members to help the board provide that independent oversight, even on some quite deep topics that they occasionally have to get into there. And the final thing I'll say is, sometimes there's a little bit of pushback in various parts of the industry that boards can never have this level of expertise required to do this. And I would push back on that because, again, if you look at various different industries. So if you look at financial services boards oversee some tremendously complex issues around financial risk. And they've all got CFOs and former chief risk officers and former heads of market risk and liquidity risk on those boards. And they've got people who are intricately familiar with that. Similarly, if you go to kind of energy boards, you've got former operators from oil and gas. If you go into medical insurers or hospital boards, you've got former doctors or chiefs of hospital departments. So there's a lot of people with a lot of experience, and there's no reason now why most boards, especially boards that have got a higher density of a digital business or an IT or technology or supply chain dependency, to have CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, and others that have that expertise. So, and again, not just that one individual person, but it being more pervasive and understanding across the board. And it's up to all of us, and it's great that we're doing this podcast series and all the other content that you guys have put out, because this is part of this background education to get all board members comfortable with asking the hard questions that can just be hard questions without always having come from a position of in-depth expertise.
So, Phil, I really like that, like the concept of kind of creating this cyber community too within boards and kind of across industry, and thinking of it kind of from the industry perspective. Are there specific groups or relevant information sharing organizations that you think boards of directors should get involved with?
Yeah, I mean, so there's obviously the National Association of Corporate Directors. They do some good work. There's other equivalents of that in other countries around the world, like the Institute of Directors in the UK. So there's a lot of groups that directors are part of that do this. There's obviously the work that we do on the Board Insights Hub, which is becoming a great compendium of knowledge. And also one of the things you find is that there's a lot of networking among board members. As the interesting thing about boards is most board members are on multiple boards, and therefore it's more like a kind of a graph and network of relationships among various different boards. And they all have their own networks and they share information. And there's various other events around kind of business conferences. There's various conferences that are run by, organizations like the World 50, and there's various other groups. And I think one of the things that, as you guys know, because you've driven it, is, a lot of our role at Google is to take some of our unique insights and not just have that in our own Board Insights Hub, but to get that content into other people's communities as well, because of the insights we bring across a range of geographies, sectors, and technical disciplines. I think we bring a level of detail on that some of the other organizations don't. And it's good that we're putting that content out to all of those places.
Well, thank you for the plug.
Yeah.
But as you have started the new chapter, what's on the horizon for you and for the cyber world in general, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I'm very focused on kind of a couple of different roles. My major role is a company called Ballistic Ventures, which is an early stage venture capital company investing in early stage cyber or cyber adjacent companies. One of the things that we're spending a lot of time there is looking at, with the waves of technology disruption from AI, and not just AI, there's a lot of reconfiguring of supply chains, of markets, of other technologies that are happening. What does that mean for the future of cyber and what the future cybersecurity businesses and technology businesses look like? Then on the other end of the investing spectrum, I'm now also a senior advisor at Warburg Pincus, which is a large private equity company. So that's more, again, on the other end of the spectrum, which is what do existing very large organizations need to do and invest in on not just cyber, but technology risk mitigation. Again, looking at what comes after what comes next as we apply AI to businesses, as we reconfigure supply chains, as lots of other activities go on. So it's just interesting getting a very different perspective. And also looking at the boards in and around those companies, from small companies to large private companies. It's interesting that there's a lot of focus from boards, not just public company boards, but large private company boards are increasingly focused on security, again, for the obvious reasons that they need to defend their organizations. But one of the bigger reasons, and this comes back to even public boards, is how to use security to deliver competitive advantage. We've talked a lot for decades about security being an enabler of business. That's never been more true because there's so many markets, individual business markets, geographies, new technologies, new applications of technology. You just cannot do unless you bring the security, the compliance, the privacy, the resilience and reliability with that. Otherwise, it's just not a useful business strategy. And I think even private company boards, not just regulated public company boards, understand the need for security to be a core part of what they do to deliver decisive competitive advantage for their customers. And that's a topic of conversation in every board, from small to large, from public to private.
No, that's great. This is a fantastic discussion, but we have to bring the episode to a close. And so I always ask kind of this final drop the mic question, which is, what is one action that our cyber savvy boardroom listeners can take away from today's discussion?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would ask all board members to do is not just focus their cybersecurity questions on the CISO. Talk to all business leadership, and also, specifically talk to the CIO or the CTO about what they're doing to build a more defendable environment that can help the CISO do their job. The most successful boards and the most successful companies at doing security is when it's management overall that take responsibility for security, not just the CISO. And boards can really wield some great effect by making a point in the boardroom or outside the boardroom of talking to the CIO and other line of business executives about what they're doing on cyber, and not just making the CISO the focus of these things. So, I would do that and good things will happen.
Excellent advice. Phil, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today on the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks.